They told everyone it was ghosts. Even Mother wanted to believe that. Cups flying from the table, doors slamming in the night, the walls shaking when I cried. They were easier to blame on spirits than on me. I tried to believe it too, because if it wasn't ghosts, then it meant I was the reason everyone was afraid. And the truth is, I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just didn't know how to stop. We lived in the lower hive levels of Warhammer, where the air tasted of recycled breath and chemical filtration, where the lights flickered even when nothing was wrong with the power grid, where thousands of families pressed together in hab blocks that groaned under their own weight. Our compartment was small, 3 rooms carved from plasteel and rockcrete, walls so thin you could hear your neighbors arguing or loving or dying. But it was ours, and Mother kept it clean despite the perpetual film of dust that settled on everything. And Father worked double shifts at the manufactorum to keep us fed, and my brother Davos made me laugh when the dark pressed too close. The first time it happened, I was 6 years old. I had dropped Mother's favorite cup ceramic, painted with flowers she said her grandmother had owned, and it shattered on the floor in 3 pieces. I started crying, not because I feared punishment, but because I knew it mattered to her, knew it was one of the few beautiful things we owned in a world of grey and rust. And while I cried, the walls began to shake, just a tremor at first, like the vibrations from the heavy machinery 3 levels down, but growing stronger until the windows rattled in their frames and dust cascaded from the ceiling. Father grabbed me, held me tight, told me to breathe, told me it was just a tremor, just the hive settling. But I felt it in my chest, felt the shaking synchronized with my sobbing, felt the connection I did not have words to name. After that, things began to happen more often. Doors would slam when I was angry, even doors I wasn't near, even doors that had been latched. Lights would flicker when I was frightened, plunging our compartment into darkness for seconds that felt like hours. Once, when Davos teased me and I shouted at him to stop, every glass object in the room, cups, plates, the windows vibrated with a high-pitched whine that made everyone cover their ears. Mother said it was the water pipes. Father said it was electrical interference. Davos said it was ghosts, grinning like it was an adventure, like we lived in one of the stories the street vendors told for spare coins. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe in ghosts or pipes, or anything except the growing certainty that I was broken, that something inside me was leaking out and affecting the world in ways I couldn't control. I tried to be good. I tried to stay calm, to keep my emotions small and manageable, to smile even when I was scared, to hold perfectly still when I wanted to scream. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes I could go days without anything strange happening, and I would think maybe it was over. Maybe I had grown out of whatever was wrong with me. Then I would have a nightmare, and I would wake to find every object in my room floating 3 inches off the floor, hovering in defiance of gravity while I gasped in terror, and they would all crash down the moment I fully woke. And everyone would come running, and we would pretend it was something else. Always something else. Never me. Davos was 12, 6 years older, tall enough to reach the high shelves, and strong enough to carry me on his shoulders through the crowded market passages. He had our father's dark hair and our mother's grey eyes, and he was the only one who never looked at me with fear or confusion when the strange things happened. When doors slammed, he would joke that our compartment was haunted by the ghost of someone who died angry. When lights flickered, he would make shadow puppets on the walls with his hands, turning the darkness into entertainment. When I woke from nightmares with objects floating around me, he would sit on my bed and talk quietly until everything settled, telling me stories about brave children who had magic powers and used them to save people. "You're going to be important someday," he told me once, his voice serious in the way it got when he meant something deeply. "I can feel it. You're special, and special people do special things." I wanted to believe him. But even then, even at 6 years old with a child's limited understanding of cause and effect, I knew that what was happening to me was not the kind of special that saved people. It was the kind of special that broke things. The neighbors began to notice. The Castellans in the compartment above us complained about vibrations disturbing their sleep. The Moroveks next door mentioned that their dishes kept falling from shelves, always when I was having a difficult day. Old Margit, from 3 doors down, a woman so ancient she remembered when the hive had open sky at the upper levels, stopped me in the corridor one day and stared at me with milky eyes that saw too much. "You're touched," she whispered, her gnarled hand gripping my shoulder with surprising strength. "I've seen it before, in my grandfather's time. The touched ones bring change, child. Whether that change is blessing or curse depends on what the Emperor wills. I didn't understand what she meant, but her words made my stomach clench with nameless dread. I ran home and didn't leave our compartment for 3 days, and during those 3 days the walls hummed with constant low-frequency vibration that made everyone's teeth ache. Mother began watching me differently. I would catch her staring when she thought I wasn't looking, her face tight with something between love and fear. She started keeping me home more, saying I was sick, saying the air outside wasn't good for children, inventing reasons why I shouldn't go to the communal learning center with the other children. Father worked longer hours, and I wondered if it was really about earning extra credits or if it was about not being home, not having to acknowledge what was becoming impossible to deny. The first person outside our family got hurt when I was 7. A boy named Tomas from the learning center had pushed Davos during a game, and Davos had fallen hard, scraping his hands bloody on the metal grating. I felt something hot and terrible surge through my chest, protective fury mixed with fear that my brother was hurt, and the surge went out from me like a wave. Tomas flew backward as though struck by an invisible hand, his body lifting off the ground and slamming into the wall 3 meters away. He fell unconscious, blood running from his nose and ears, and everyone screamed, and adults came running. And no one saw me standing there with my hands clenched into fists and my whole body shaking. They said Tomas had slipped, that he had hit his head on a protruding pipe. They said it was an accident, just children playing too rough in dangerous spaces. But Tomas's mother looked at me when they carried her son away, looked at me with eyes full of knowledge and horror, and I knew she knew, even if she would never say it aloud. After that, I stopped going outside almost entirely. Mother didn't have to invent excuses anymore, I made them myself, claiming stomach aches or tiredness, or any reason to stay in our compartment where I couldn't hurt anyone. Davos tried to coax me out, tried to make me play games or go to the markets, but I refused. I was safer inside, I thought. Everyone was safer if I stayed in one place and kept my emotions as small and controlled as possible. But emotions don't work that way. The more I tried to suppress them, the more they built up pressure, until even small frustrations would trigger manifestations that grew increasingly severe. A bad dream would cause the temperature in our compartment to drop until frost formed on the walls. A moment of sadness would make shadows gather in the corners, thick and dark and almost solid. And once, when I was desperately lonely after weeks of self-imposed isolation, I started talking to someone who wasn't there. I didn't realize I was doing it at first. I was sitting in my room, playing with a simple wooden puzzle Davos had made for me, and I started explaining how the pieces fit together to someone I thought was beside me. I described the shapes and colors to my invisible companion, and they responded not with words I heard, but with understanding I felt, a presence that made the loneliness ease. It felt warm and safe, like having a friend who understood everything without needing explanations. Mother found me an hour later, still talking animatedly to empty air, and the look on her face made me stop mid-sentence. She knelt in front of me, took my hands in hers, and asked very carefully who I was talking to. "My friend," I said simply, confused by her distress. "What friend, sweetheart? There's no one here but us." I looked to where I had felt the presence, but it had faded the moment Mother entered. I couldn't explain how I knew someone had been there, how I had felt their attention and their comfort. They were here, I insisted weakly. They were listening. Mother pulled me into a tight embrace, and I felt her trembling. Over her shoulder, I saw Father standing in the doorway, his face gray with an emotion I would only later recognize as terror. They whispered to each other that night, voices low and urgent through the thin walls, and I heard words that meant nothing to me then: unsanctioned, witch-touched, black ships. The drawing started around the same time. I would pick up a stylus and find my hand moving across paper without conscious direction, sketching the same face over and over, a person I had never seen, with hard features and eyes that seemed to look directly at me even in crude child's renderings. The face was neither male nor female, neither kind nor cruel, just intensely present, as though the act of drawing them was calling them closer. Davos found the drawings hidden under my mattress, dozens of them, all the same face from slightly different angles. "Who is this?" he asked, spreading them across my bed. "I don't know," I admitted. "They just come out when I draw. I don't mean to make them." He studied the drawings with furrowed brow, then gathered them carefully and hid them in his own room. "Don't show these to Mother or Father," he said quietly. I don't think they'd understand, but it was too late for hiding, too late for pretending, too late for any of the comfortable lies we had been telling ourselves. The local priest came to visit 3 days later, a thin man in worn ecclesiastical robes, his face lined with decades of tending to the spiritual needs of the lower hive. He spoke with mother and father, in hushed tones, while I listened from my room, catching fragments. Abnormal phenomena, Imperial duty, the safety of the community. Signs that must not be ignored. When he finally came to speak with me, his face was kind, but his eyes were afraid. He asked me gentle questions about the things that happened around me, about the friends I talked to, about the face I drew. I answered honestly, still too young to understand that honesty could be dangerous, that there were truths the Imperium did not tolerate. He left with promises to pray for our family, to seek guidance from higher authorities, to help us understand what was happening. Mother thanked him with tears in her eyes, believing or desperately wanting to believe that help was coming. Father said nothing, just stood with his hand on my shoulder, his grip tight enough to hurt. That night, Davos climbed into my bed like he used to when I was smaller, and the darkness frightened me. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "I'll keep you safe." That's what big brothers do. I fell asleep, believing him, not knowing that some promises are impossible to keep, that some dangers are too vast for love alone to hold back. I dreamed of the face I had been drawing, and in the dream they were walking toward me through fire and shadow. And I was not afraid. I was running toward them, arms outstretched, feeling something like recognition, like destiny, like the inevitable end of a story that had been written before I was born. The change in how people looked at me was gradual at first, then sudden, like ice cracking under weight. Neighbors who had known me since birth began crossing to the other side of the corridor when they saw me coming. Children I had played with were called inside when I appeared. Even the vendors in the market passages, usually eager for any sale, would complete their transactions with Mother quickly and tersely, their eyes sliding away from me as though looking directly might invite contamination. Mother stopped trying to explain it away. The pretense of ghosts and faulty wiring fell aside, replaced by tense silence and careful monitoring of my every mood. She developed a kind of hypervigilance, watching for the first signs of emotional upset so she could intervene before anything manifested. If I seemed sad, she would immediately distract me with tasks or stories. If I seemed angry, she would speak in soothing tones and guide me to breathing exercises she had learned from somewhere. If I seemed frightened, she would hold me tight and pray under her breath, words I couldn't quite make out, but which seemed directed at the Emperor, asking for protection or mercy, or perhaps just understanding. Father stopped meeting my eyes entirely. He would look at my shoulder or past my head, and when he spoke to me, his voice was overly gentle, the careful tone people use with dangerous animals. He began volunteering for extra shifts, sometimes staying away for days at a time, sleeping in the manufactorum's worker dormitories rather than coming home. When he did return, he looked exhausted beyond mere physical tiredness, hollowed out, as though something essential had been carved from him and not replaced. Only Davos remained unchanged. He still joked with me, still played games, still treated me like the little sibling I had always been, rather than something to be feared and managed. When the others pulled away, he drew closer, becoming my anchor to normalcy, the single point of proof that I was still human, still worthy of casual affection. "Tell me a story," I would ask him on the difficult days, when the pressure in my chest felt like it might split me open if I didn't find release. And he would tell me stories from the Imperial histories he learned at the upper-level scholarium, tales of heroes and saints, of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. He would tell them differently than the instructors did, though, adding details they probably wouldn't approve of. Heroes who were frightened but acted anyway, saints who made mistakes but kept trying, ordinary people who sometimes failed but whose failures taught them how to eventually succeed. "The Emperor protects," he told me once, "but sometimes I think he protects us by giving us each other, by making sure we're not alone when things get hard." I held on to those words like a lifeline, believing that as long as I had Davos, I could bear anything else. That belief made what happened next even worse. I had been trying so hard to be good, to keep my emotions small and controlled, that when I finally lost control, it was over something absurdly minor. Mother had made promethium cakes a rare treat, expensive and difficult to obtain in the lower hive. She had divided them fairly among the 4 of us, but father gave his portion to Davos, saying he wasn't hungry. It was a small kindness, or should have been, but I saw the way father looked at Davos when he did it with open affection and pride, and then I saw the way he didn't look at me, the careful absence of eye contact, and something in me cracked. I didn't mean to lash out. I didn't even realize I was doing it. I just felt a surge of bitter loneliness and hurt, and that feeling went out from me like an invisible blade. Everyone in the room gasped and doubled over as though struck in the stomach, and then the pain passed and they straightened, looking at me with expressions I couldn't read, not anger, not fear exactly, but something more complicated and more terrible. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't mean." "It's all right," Mother said, but her voice was shaky, and her hand pressed against her abdomen as though expecting to find injury there. "It's all right, sweetheart. Just breathe. Just stay calm." But it wasn't all right. Over the next hour, all three of them developed symptoms: nausea, dizziness, a creeping numbness that started in their extremities and spread inward. Davos was the worst affected. He collapsed halfway through evening prayers, his face grey and clammy, his breathing shallow. Mother and father carried him to his bed while I stood frozen in the doorway, knowing somehow that this was my fault, that the pain I had sent out had lodged inside them and was still working. The local medicae came, an overworked woman with kind eyes and rough hands, and examined Davos thoroughly. She found nothing physically wrong, no injury or disease, but he was suffering from some kind of systemic shock that she couldn't explain. She left medication that might help with the symptoms and instructions to bring him to the upper-level medicae facility if he didn't improve. He improved slowly over 3 days, the color returning to his face, his strength gradually rebuilding, but there was a new wariness in how he moved around me, a subtle hesitation before he touched me, as though some part of him now understood that proximity to me carried risk. He tried to hide it, tried to maintain the easy affection we had always shared, but I felt the change like a physical wound. "I hurt you," I said to him one night when we were alone. "It wasn't your fault," he responded automatically, "but I did it. I didn't mean to, but I did." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah," he finally admitted. "You did. I'm sorry. I know." He reached out and ruffled my hair, the gesture carefully casual. "We'll figure it out. Somehow," but I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe it any more than I did. There was no figuring out whatever was wrong with me. It was growing stronger, becoming more difficult to control, manifesting in ways that were increasingly dangerous, and the harder I tried to suppress it, the more violently it erupted when my control finally slipped. The invisible friends came back, more distinct this time. I would wake in the night to find figures standing in my room, not quite solid, more like dense shadow or thickened air, but present in a way that felt undeniable. They never spoke in words I could hear, but I understood them somehow, felt their thoughts pressing against mine. They were curious about me, drawn by something they sensed, offering companionship that came with an undercurrent of hunger I was too young to recognize as dangerous. "Who are you talking to?" Mother asked one morning, finding me in deep conversation with empty air. "The friends," I said simply, not understanding why her face went so pale. She pulled me close, gripping my shoulders hard enough to bruise. "Listen to me very carefully. Those are not friends. Do you understand? Whatever you're seeing, whatever you're hearing, they are not friends, and you must not speak to them. Do you understand?" I nodded, frightened by her intensity, but I didn't really understand. The friends felt comforting in a way nothing else did anymore. They didn't flinch from me. They didn't watch me with barely concealed fear. They accepted me exactly as I was, and in the growing isolation of my life, that acceptance felt like water in a desert. They came more frequently after that, despite Mother's warnings. Sometimes I woke to find them gathered around my bed like a circle of watchers. Sometimes I saw them from the corner of my eye, vanishing when I turned to look directly. Sometimes I heard them whispering, voices layered over each other, until individual words became impossible to distinguish from the overall susurrus of sound. And sometimes, on the worst nights, I felt them inside my head, pressing against my thoughts, showing me images of places I had never been and could not possibly imagine on my own, vast spaces filled with contradictory geometry, colors that hurt to perceive, entities that existed in too many dimensions to comprehend. I tried to tell Davos about them, but the words came out wrong. describing impossibilities that made him look at me with confusion and growing alarm. I tried to draw them, but my hands could only produce approximations that looked like nothing, swirls and angles that suggested depth without actually depicting anything real. The priest came back, accompanied this time by another man in different robes, someone from higher up the ecclesiastical hierarchy, someone whose presence made everyone in our compartment straighten and speak more carefully. They asked me more questions, these ones probing deeper, asking about the friends and the drawings, and whether I ever heard voices or saw things I knew weren't real. I answered as honestly as I could, not understanding that I was confirming suspicions that would seal my fate. The senior priest listened with an expression of sorrowful certainty, then spoke privately with my parents while the local priest stayed with me, asking about my religious education, whether I knew my prayers, whether I understood the Emperor's love for humanity. "The Emperor protects," I recited dutifully, the phrase beaten into every child from the moment they could speak. "Yes," the priest said, but his voice was heavy with meanings I couldn't parse. "He protects humanity from many threats, even from itself when necessary." After they left, Mother cried for hours. Father sat at the table with his head in his hands, not moving, barely seeming to breathe, and Davos held me on my bed, his arms wrapped around me tight, whispering that everything would be all right, even though both of us knew it was a lie. The nightmares intensified. I dreamed of burning worlds and screaming void, of entities so vast they used planets as playthings, of a realm where thought became reality, and reality was fluid as water. I dreamed of the face I had been drawing, closer now, walking toward me through flames that didn't consume them, reaching out with hands that promised something, rescue or capture, or perhaps both simultaneously, concepts that became identical in the dream logic. And I dreamed of myself, older, standing in a place of cold metal and colder purpose, surrounded by others like me, children and young adults with haunted eyes and power that leaked from them like radiation. In the dream I was screaming, but the scream had no sound, and no one came to comfort me because everyone understood that comfort was no longer possible, that we had moved beyond the realm where such ordinary human gestures had meaning. I woke from that dream to find every object in my room floating, rotating slowly in the air as though gravity had forgotten them. They stayed suspended for several minutes even after I was fully conscious, and I realized with numb horror that I wasn't doing it anymore, it was simply happening around me, my presence warping reality even when I wasn't trying to, even when I was desperate for everything to just be normal. Davos found me sitting in the center of my floating room, tears streaming down my face, and instead of being afraid, he simply waded through the suspended objects and sat beside me, taking my hand in his. Everything crashed to the floor the moment he touched me, as though his contact broke whatever force was holding them up. "It's getting worse," I whispered. "I know. I'm scared." "Me too." We sat together in the wreckage of my room, holding hands, while the hab block groaned around us, and distant sounds of the hive's nightlife filtered through the walls, arguments and celebrations, and the perpetual hum of machinery that was the heartbeat of our world. I wanted to memorize this moment, to hold on to the feeling of his hand in mine, because some part of me understood that our time was running out, that forces larger than family love were converging on us, and when they arrived, everything would change in ways that could not be undone. The face from my drawings appeared in my dreams that night, and this time they spoke, not in words but in pure meaning, and the meaning was, "Soon, I am coming soon." I woke with my heart racing, and found Davos asleep beside me, his face peaceful in a way mine would never be again. I watched him breathe in the dim light filtering through our window, and I prayed, really prayed, for the first time with genuine desperation rather than rote recitation, asking the Emperor to protect him, to keep him safe from whatever was coming, even if that meant keeping him safe from me. The Emperor did not answer, or perhaps he did, and the answer was simply that some prayers come too late, and some fates are written too firmly to be altered by the pleas of frightened children who don't yet understand the machinery of the Imperium they were born into. The change came on a Tuesday, though I only remember that because Tuesday was ration distribution day, and Mother had been preparing to join the queue when everything fell apart. I woke to the sound of her screaming, not in fear or pain, but in raw anguish, the kind of sound that comes from something breaking inside. I ran to find her in the main room, collapsed on the floor, clutching her head as though trying to keep it from splitting open. Father was beside her, his face twisted in agony, hands pressed over his ears. Davos staggered from his room, pale and shaking, and I stood frozen in my doorway, watching them suffer and knowing with sickening certainty that I was the cause. "Make it stop," Mother gasped. "Please, Emperor, preserve us. Make it stop." But I didn't know what it was, didn't know what I was doing to them, couldn't find the off switch for whatever was pouring out of me. I tried to push it back, tried to contain it, but that only made it worse, like trying to hold back a flood by pressing your hands against the water. The pressure built in my chest until I thought my ribs would crack, and the walls began to shake again, harder than they ever had, and somewhere in the distance I heard alarms beginning to sound. The invisible friends were everywhere now, no longer confined to my room or the shadows. They filled our compartment like smoke, their presence thick and suffocating, and I could see them clearly for the first time, not solid but not quite intangible either, shapes that suggested human form but wrong in fundamental ways, too many joints or too few features, existing in angles that my eyes couldn't properly process. "Help me," I pleaded with them, desperate. "Please help me stop this." They responded with a sensation like laughter, not cruel but not kind either, merely amused by the concept that I thought I had any control, that I ever had. And then one of them reached toward me with something like a hand, and when it touched my forehead, the world exploded into sensation and knowledge I was never meant to have. I saw the warp, actually saw it, not as dream or metaphor but as the reality underlying reality, the roiling chaos of thought and emotion made manifest, the place where human consciousness touched something vast and hungry and eternally screaming. I saw the things that lived there, entities of pure predatory intelligence feeding on the psychic emanations of humanity, growing fat on fear and rage and desire. I saw what I was, a beacon, a lighthouse in the darkness, my untrained psychic presence radiating outward through space and time, drawing attention from things that should never have noticed one small child in one overcrowded hive. And I saw what would happen if I remained uncontrolled, untrained, unconstrained. Worlds burning, the warp bleeding through into reality wherever I stood, thousands or millions dying as my power grew beyond any ability to contain. I saw myself as a gateway, a crack in the universe through which nightmares could pour. And I understood with perfect, terrible clarity why the Imperium hunted people like me with such relentless determination. The vision ended as abruptly as it began, and I collapsed, gasping for air that suddenly felt too thick to breathe. The shaking had stopped. The invisible friends had withdrawn, satisfied that their message had been delivered. My family lay sprawled across the room, unconscious but breathing, and I was alone with the knowledge that I was dangerous in ways I had never imagined, that love and good intentions meant nothing measured against the cosmic threat I represented. Someone was pounding on the door, neighbors responding to the alarm, to the disturbance. I heard authoritative voices demanding entry, heard the door mechanism being overridden, heard boots on metal grating. I should have been frightened, but I felt only exhausted relief. Whatever was coming, at least the waiting would be over. The local priest entered first, accompanied by men in the dark uniforms of planetary defense. They took in the scene, the unconscious family, the shaking child, the air that still hummed with residual psychic energy, and the priest's face confirmed what I had seen in the vision. He knew what I was, he had known and reported it, and now the consequences were arriving. "Is this the child?" one of the uniformed men asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes," the priest confirmed. "I'm sorry, I truly am." But his apology meant nothing, changed nothing. The wheels were already turning, machinery larger than any individual compassion grinding toward inevitable conclusions. The uniformed men approached me carefully, hands on weapons they probably wouldn't need, and I didn't resist. "What would have been the point? You're going to come with us," one of them said, not unkindly. "There are people who can help you, people who understand what you're going through." I nodded, mute, and let them lead me out of our compartment. Mother was starting to wake, her eyes fluttering open, focusing on me being taken away. She tried to rise, to come after me, but Father held her back, whether to protect her or to protect me from her reaction, I couldn't tell. "No," she moaned. "Please, she's just a child. She's my baby, please. We'll bring her back." The uniformed man lied smoothly, practiced. "Once we've assessed the situation and provided appropriate treatment." But I saw the truth in the priest's eyes, in the way the other neighbors looked at me, relief mixed with horror, glad the threat was being removed, but aware enough to recognize the tragedy of it. Children who were taken for psychic evaluation rarely returned, and when they did, they were fundamentally changed, hollowed out and refilled with someone the Imperium could use. They took me to a detention facility in the Mid-Hive, a place designed for processing criminals and heretics before their final disposition. I was placed in a small cell with a narrow cot and a single flickering lumen, and I waited. Hours passed, or maybe days' time became fluid in that grey space, marked only by the periodic delivery of food I couldn't eat and water I forced down mechanically. The invisible friends came to visit, passing through the walls as though they didn't exist, gathering around me in that cell. They were different now that I had seen them, truly less comforting, more alien, their presence making reality feel thin and unreliable. They whispered things I tried not to understand, showed me images I tried to forget, offered power and knowledge that came with prices I was beginning to comprehend. "Leave me alone," I begged them. "Please, just leave me alone." But they couldn't or wouldn't. I had called to them, intentionally or not, and now they had invested too much attention to simply withdraw. I was their project, their point of entry, their anchor to the material realm, and every moment I existed uncontrolled and untrained, I made that anchor stronger. On what I think was the third day, new people came, not local authorities but something else, something official in a way that made the detention facility staff snap to attention and clear corridors. They wore plain grey uniforms with no insignia, carried no visible weapons, but radiated authority that was terrifying in its absolute confidence. The one who entered my cell was neither young nor old, neither male nor female in any way I could easily categorize, their features seeming to shift slightly depending on the angle I viewed them from. And I knew their face because I had been drawing it for months, knew their presence because I had been feeling them approaching like an oncoming storm, knew with dream logic certainty that this was the person who would decide what happened to me next. "Hello," they said, their voice surprisingly gentle. "My name is Interrogator Vance. I'm here to help you." I said nothing, studying the face I had drawn 100 times, seeing details I had gotten right, and others I had missed: the scar above their left eyebrow, the slight asymmetry of their eyes, the way they held themselves with practiced stillness that suggested they could explode into violence at any moment. "I know you're frightened," Vance continued, crouching to be at eye level with me. "I know everything in your life has become confusing and terrible, but I want you to understand something very important. You are not evil. What you have is not a curse. It's a gift that humanity needs, but it's a gift that requires training to be safe. Do you understand? You're going to take me away," I said, my voice flat with accepted reality. "Yes," Vance confirmed, not bothering with comforting lies. "But not to hurt you, to train you, to teach you control, to help you become something greater than the danger you currently pose." "What about my family?" Something flickered across Vance's face, not quite sympathy, but recognition of loss. "They'll be cared for, compensated, informed that you're serving the Imperium in ways they cannot know but should take pride in. That's not the same as seeing them again." "No," Vance agreed. "It's not." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that honesty settling between us. Finally, I asked, "When?" "Soon. The ship is in orbit. We're just completing the necessary documentation." Vance stood, preparing to leave. "I'll come for you personally when it's time. Try to rest. The journey will be difficult." After they left, I lay on the narrow cot and stared at the ceiling, trying to memorize the details of the life I was leaving behind: Mother's face when she smiled, Father's rough hands, Davos's laugh, the smell of our compartment, and the sound of the hive's machinery, and the feeling of being part of a family. I hoarded these memories like treasure, knowing they would have to sustain me through whatever came next. The invisible friends pressed closer, excited now. Sensing the approaching transition, they showed me images of the ship, black and vast and terrible, more like a void creature than a machine, designed to contain and transport the psychically gifted across star systems. They showed me the others I would meet there, children and adults with haunted eyes and power that leaked from them like radiation. They showed me the training that awaited, the conditioning, the careful breaking and remaking of personality into something useful to the Imperium. And they showed me the face I would become: older, colder, hollowed out and refilled with purpose that had nothing to do with my own desires. Powerful, certainly. Controlled, absolutely. but fundamentally changed in ways that meant the child I currently was would effectively die even if my body lived on. Is that really my future? I whispered to the shadows. The response came as pure knowing rather than words, one possible future among many, but the most likely, the most probable. The one the Imperium has written for you since the moment you drew your first breath. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I existed in a grey state between waking and unconsciousness, aware of every passing moment, marking time until Interrogator Vance returned, and the next chapter of my life, the final chapter of the person I currently was, began. Vance came for me at what must have been early morning, though the detention facility's artificial light made time meaningless. They appeared at my cell door without warning, without the preliminary sounds of approach, as though they had simply materialized from nothing. Perhaps they had after everything I had seen. I no longer presumed to know what was possible. "It's time," Vance said simply. "Are you ready?" I wasn't, but readiness was irrelevant. I stood on shaking legs and followed them through corridors that seemed longer than they had been, stretching toward a destination I couldn't see and couldn't avoid. The detention facility staff watched us pass with expressions of relief and pity, glad to be rid of the dangerous psycho child. Sorry for whatever awaited me at my destination. I expected them to take me directly to wherever the ship waited, but instead Vance led me to a small office where two other people sat waiting, people I knew, even though they seemed to have aged years in the few days since I'd seen them. Mother and father looked shattered, held together by sheer will and perhaps sedatives, their eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "You requested to see them," Vance said quietly to me. "We're allowing 10 minutes. No more." Mother made a sound like a wounded animal and pulled me into an embrace that felt like it might crush my ribs. She was crying, or perhaps had never stopped crying, her face wet against my hair. Father wrapped his arms around both of us, and for a moment we were what we had been, a family, imperfect but complete, holding on to each other against forces neither they nor I fully understood. "Where's Davos?" I asked, and the question made Mother's crying intensify. "He couldn't come," Father said, his voice rough. "He wanted to, but..." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. The truth was, I realized, they probably wouldn't let him see me. Davos was young enough, impressionable enough, that prolonged contact with an identified psyker might be considered contamination risk. Better to make the break clean, to seal off the past completely. I would never see my brother again, never hear his laugh or his stories or his promises that everything would be all right. "Tell him I love him," I whispered. "Tell him it's not his fault. None of this is his fault." "Of course not," Mother said fiercely. "It's not anyone's fault. You didn't choose this. You're just a child." But that wasn't quite true, and we all knew it. I had chosen, in small ways, chosen to indulge the invisible friends, chosen to explore the sensations and visions they offered, chosen to draw the face that had been calling me. Innocence was not the same as blamelessness, and understanding that distinction was part of growing up, even if I was growing up far too fast and in directions I had never intended. "I'm sorry," I said, "for all of it, for being difficult, for hurting you, for not being what you wanted." "You are exactly what we wanted," Father said, his voice breaking. "Don't ever think otherwise. We love you. We will always love you. Whatever they tell you about yourself, whatever they make you become, remember that once you were loved completely." Vance appeared at the door. "Time." Mother held me tighter, as though physical strength alone could prevent what was coming. "We could run," she whispered desperately. "All of us. We could disappear into the underhive, change our names, hide." "You can't hide from the black ships," Vance said, not unkindly. "No one can. And attempting to would only make everything worse for you, for your daughter, for anyone who helped you. The best thing you can do for her now is let her go and know that she'll be serving the Imperium in ways that matter." It was cold comfort, bureaucratic comfort, the kind that prioritized order over compassion. But it was also true. There was no running from this. The Imperium's reach extended to every corner of human space, and a psychically gifted child was far too valuable, far too dangerous to be allowed to simply vanish. Father gently pried Mother's arms away from me, holding her as she made sounds of protest that gradually dissolved into helpless sobbing. He looked at me with eyes that held everything he couldn't say, pride and grief and love and guilt all tangled together, and then he turned away because watching me leave was more than he could bear. Vance placed a hand on my shoulder, firm but not rough, and guided me from the room. I looked back once and saw Mother collapsed against Father, both of them holding each other in the wreckage of their family, and then the door closed and they were gone from my life as completely as though they had never existed. The transport to the ship was a heavily armored vehicle that moved through the hive like a shark through water, fast and purposeful, other traffic clearing out of its way automatically. Through the narrow windows I watched my world pass by the hab blocks and markets and industrial sectors that had been my entire universe, now revealed as a tiny fraction of a much larger city, which was itself a tiny fraction of an entire planet, which was a single point in an Imperium so vast that human minds couldn't properly comprehend its scale. Other children were being loaded into the transport at various stops, some crying, some silent, all radiating the same barely controlled psychic energy that made reality feel unstable in their vicinity. We didn't speak to each other, locked in private grief and fear. A girl about my age, who got on at the mid-hive commercial sector, had already been crying so long her face was raw. A boy younger than me, maybe 4 or 5, clutched a toy servo skull that looked handmade, and his fingers glowed faintly with psychic energy that made the toy twitch and whir even though it had no actual power source. Vance sat in the front with the driver, occasionally making notes on a data slate, processing us like cargo, valuable cargo. Certainly, but cargo nonetheless. At one stop, a woman tried to force her way onto the transport, screaming that they couldn't take her son, that he was just sick and would get better, that the flickering lights and moving objects were something explainable. Security removed her with practiced efficiency, and her son watched through the window with eyes that held too much understanding for his age. He knew his mother was wrong. He knew what he was. He was just glad someone had finally stopped pretending otherwise. The spaceport was unlike anything I had ever seen, vast beyond comprehension, with ceilings so high they disappeared into haze. Ships of every size and configuration docked in berths that stretched to the horizon. But the black ship was unmistakable, even among thousands of others. It was matte black, angular in ways that seemed deliberately wrong, covered in Gothic inscriptions and purity seals that marked it as something sacred and terrible. Looking at it hurt, not physically but spiritually, as though my soul recognized something antithetical to comfort or hope. "Home for the foreseeable future," Vance said quietly, seeing my reaction. "Try not to judge it by its appearance. What happens inside is necessary, and those who make it through training become some of the Imperium's most valuable servants." "What about those who don't make it through?" I asked. Vance's silence was answer enough. "They processed us methodically, names recorded, families documented, power levels assessed through instruments I didn't understand. Each child was assigned a number and a category: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta. I was classified Delta, which Vance explained meant raw power with minimal control, the most dangerous category, requiring the most intensive training, or the most intensive containment if training fails," another handler added, and Vance shot them a look that promised consequences for that honesty. They separated us into groups and led us through corridors that seemed to exist in wrong dimensions, turning in directions that shouldn't have been possible, ascending or descending in ways that contradicted the visual evidence of level flaws. The ship was deliberately disorienting, I realized designed to be incomprehensible, to prevent any sense of navigation or escape. The holding cell they assigned to my group was large enough for 20 children, with simple cots along the walls and a central space for whatever activities they would eventually require of us. We huddled in small clusters, not quite brave enough for conversation but desperate for proximity to other beings who understood what was happening. The invisible friends were everywhere now, thick as fog, drawn by the concentration of psychic energy. They pressed against the ship's walls like prisoners seeking escape, and I wondered if they had always been here, if every black ship carried this invisible cargo of warp entities feeding on the fear and power of the gifted children within. An older boy, maybe 13 or 14, eventually took it upon himself to speak to the group. "I've heard stories about this place," he said, his voice cracking with stress and adolescence. "They break you down and rebuild you. Those who survive become sanctioned psychers, astropaths, or battle psychers, or advisors. Those who don't..." He made a throat-cutting gesture that probably seemed dramatic to him, but mostly looked desperate. "That's not helping," a girl said sharply. She was older than most of us, maybe 16, with eyes that suggested she had already been broken and rebuilt once before whatever gift manifested in her required collection. "We're here. Nothing we say or do will change that. Better to face it with whatever dignity we can manage. Dignity. The word felt absurd, applied to children torn from their families and imprisoned on a ship designed to contain nightmares. But I understood what she meant, the refusal to dissolve completely, to maintain some core of self, even as everything else was stripped away. Time passed in strange increments. Without natural light or consistent routine, minutes could feel like hours and hours like minutes. They fed us regularly and allowed us access to sanitation facilities and provided thin blankets against the ship's omnipresent cold. But they also watched us constantly. Cameras and sensors tracking our every movement, measuring our psychic output, categorizing our manifestations. Some children broke immediately, their power erupting in uncontrolled bursts that required sedation or restraint. Others withdrew into catatonia, refusing to engage with a reality too terrible to acknowledge. I existed somewhere between those extremes, present but detached, aware but choosing not to examine that awareness too closely. And then, after what might have been days or weeks, the training began. They came for us in groups of 5, leading us to chambers lined with hexagrammic wards and psychic dampening equipment, where stern instructors taught us the first principles of control visualization exercises, mental compartmentalization, the construction of internal barriers between self and the warp. "Your gift is not you," Instructor Valkara told us, her scarred face severe. "It is a tool you possess, a weapon you must learn to wield. Confusing the two will destroy you faster than any demonic possession. You are not your power, you are the will that directs it." But that was a lie, or at least not entirely true. The power was inextricably tied to who we were, shaped by our personalities and histories and the specific ways our souls intersected with the warp. Separating the two required violence to the psyche, required cutting away parts of ourselves and accepting that whatever remained would be fundamentally altered. I learned to build walls in my mind, rooms within rooms where I could lock away emotions and memories too volatile for safe expression. I learned to recognize the touch of warp entities and to refuse their offers of knowledge or power, no matter how seductive. I learned to function while constantly monitored, constantly tested, constantly reminded that failure meant death or worse, and slowly, incrementally, the child I had been died. Not literally, my body continued, my memories persisted, my name remained attached to official documentation, but the essential innocence, the capacity for uncomplicated joy or unguarded affection, the sense that the universe might fundamentally care about my welfare, all of that eroded under the relentless pressure of training and discipline. I became someone who could function, someone who could serve, someone whose power was contained and directed rather than wild and dangerous. But I also became someone who remembered being different, who carried ghost weight of the person I should have been, who looked at my own reflection and saw a stranger staring back. The invisible friends still came sometimes, but I had learned to refuse them, to close the doors through which they entered. They whispered from beyond the barriers I built, promises of reunion with family or escape from the ship, or simply an end to the loneliness. But I knew better now. I knew the price of their gifts, knew that every door open to them was a door that might never fully close again. Somewhere in the spaces between training sessions, as the ship moved through the warp toward destinations I was not informed of, I accepted the truth. I would never see my family again, never hear Davos's stories or feel mother's embrace or hear father's rough voice. They existed now only as memories behind mental walls, treasures I could visit but never truly touch again. And that knowledge, that final acceptance of irrevocable loss, was perhaps the last death of childhood, the moment when possibility collapsed into inevitability, when the future I had imagined vanished completely, replaced by the future the Imperium had written for me before I was born. Time aboard the black ship became fluid, measured not in days or weeks but in training cycles and psychological evaluations and gradual increments of control over powers I was learning to understand. I stopped asking where we were going or when we would arrive, because those questions implied I had any agency in the journey, any choice about the destination. I was cargo being delivered, and cargo does not choose its route. The instructors were relentless but not cruel, at least not gratuitously cruel. They pushed us to our limits and beyond, but always with purpose, always testing whether we could be salvaged or whether we were too far gone to safely deploy. Some children washed out of the program, taken away in the night, and never mentioned again. We learned not to ask what happened to them, learned to accept that every morning's count might be smaller than the previous evening's, learned to forge no attachments deeper than surface camaraderie, because attachment was a liability in a place where half of us wouldn't survive to deployment. I became proficient at the mental exercises, at building and maintaining the complex architecture of walls and rooms and locked doors that kept the warp at bay. I learned to recognize the subtle pressure that preceded an involuntary manifestation and to redirect that energy into harmless expressions, heat that warmed my hands instead of setting fires, kinetic force that lifted small objects instead of throwing people across rooms. I learned to sleep without dreaming, or at least without remembering dreams, because dreams were the most vulnerable time when warp entities probed for entry points in our mental defenses. The girl who had spoken about dignity on that first day became something like a friend, though we were both careful not to call it that. Her name was Sire, and she had been collected from a noble house on some world I'd never heard of, her gift manifesting during a formal dinner when her anger at some slight had caused every glass in the room to shatter simultaneously. She taught me tricks the instructors didn't: how to fake composure when you were terrified, how to redirect attention when you were losing control, how to recognize which instructors could be reasoned with and which were simply enforcers of protocol. The key, she told me one sleep cycle while we lay in adjacent cots, is to remember that you're being shaped into a weapon. Weapons don't have feelings about their purpose, they simply fulfill their function. The more you can think of yourself that way, the easier it gets. But I'm not a weapon, I protested. I'm a person. You're both, Sire corrected. But only one of those aspects matters to the Imperium, and fighting that reality only makes everything harder. I wanted to reject her cynicism, to insist on maintaining my humanity despite the system designed to erode it. But I also recognized the survival wisdom in her words. The children who struggled most were those who clung too tightly to who they had been, who refused to adapt, who kept insisting that this was temporary and they would eventually return to their families. Those children either broke completely or were removed from the program, and I had no illusions about which fate was preferable. So I learned to perform the role of the compliant trainee, to demonstrate steady progress, to show appropriate responses during psychological evaluations. And beneath that performance, I built a hidden room in my mental architecture where I kept the memories of my family, the stories Davos had told, the feeling of mother's hands braiding my hair, the sound of father's tired footsteps returning from work. I visited that room rarely and carefully, rationing access like precious water, because every visit reminded me of everything I had lost and threatened the composure necessary for survival. Months passed, maybe a year, time having become too abstract to track reliably. My body changed, growing taller, developing the awkward proportions of early adolescence. My face in the reflection of polished metal surfaces became harder to recognize, the childhood softness replaced by angles and an expression of perpetual wariness. I was becoming someone new, someone shaped by trauma and training into a form the Imperium could use. The ship eventually emerged from the warp at a destination that was never named to us. We were transferred to a facility on a planet's surface, a fortress monastery dedicated to the training of sanctioned psychers, where we would spend additional years learning to refine our abilities into specific, useful applications. Some would become astropaths, their minds burned out and rebuilt to serve as living communications relays. Others would become battle psychers attached to military formations, or advisors to inquisitors, or any of a dozen specialized roles requiring psychic talent. I was tested extensively and assigned to a track for empathic specialist psychers who could read and influence emotional states, useful for interrogation, negotiation, and psychological warfare. The irony was not lost on me that the gift which had manifested as uncontrolled empathic broadcasting in my childhood was being refined into a tool for manipulating others. But I had learned not to dwell on ironies. I simply did what was required, progressed through the training, demonstrated competence in my assigned specialization. Years accumulated. I lost track of how many. My body reached full adulthood, my face in reflections becoming that of a stranger I barely recognized. The instructors changed, or perhaps I simply stopped distinguishing between them, seeing only the roles they represented rather than whatever individuals inhabited those roles. Other trainees came and went, and I learned their names only long enough to use them, then let them slip away when those individuals disappeared from the program. Sire graduated before me, assigned to an inquisitorial retinue operating in some distant subsector. We said goodbye with the same carefully controlled affect we had maintained throughout our acquaintance, acknowledging the debt I owed her for survival lessons while avoiding any deeper expression of connection. Attachment was still liability. Even after all these years, especially after all these years, that truth remained foundational. When my own graduation finally came, it was perfunctory rather than celebratory. An administrative officer informed me that I was being assigned to an Adeptus Arbites precinct fortress as empathic interrogation support, that my transport would depart in 2 days, that I should report to quartermaster for supply requisition. No ceremony, no acknowledgement of the years of training or the childhood sacrificed. Just orders delivered with bureaucratic efficiency. I thought I would feel something relief or dread or even simple curiosity about what awaited me. Instead, I felt only the familiar numb detachment I had cultivated over years of systematic emotional control. I was being deployed. I would serve. Beyond that, speculation was pointless. The night before departure, I allowed myself one final visit to the hidden room in my mental architecture where I kept my family memories. I walked through them methodically, mother's face when she smiled, father's rough hands, Davos's laugh, and his stories about heroes who were frightened but acted anyway. I tried to remember the sound of their voices, the particular cadence of their speech, the feeling of being part of a unit that existed for its own sake rather than for service to larger institutions. The memories were fading, eroded by time and the mental disciplines required to survive training. Mother's face had become generic, the specific details of her features smoothing into archetypal representations. Father's voice had lost its distinctive roughness, becoming simply a man's voice, without particular character. Even Davos, who I had loved most and remembered most deliberately, was becoming more impression than person, a sense of warmth and protection rather than the specific individual he had been. I tried to hold on to them, to refresh the details, to keep them vivid. But the effort itself revealed how much had already been lost. I was trying to remember people who had effectively become ghosts, preserved in memory but no longer fully real, no longer fully present in any meaningful sense. And I realized, with the clarity that comes from accepting unwelcome truths, that this was another kind of death, not the death of my body, but the death of my connections, the final severing of ties to a life that had existed before the black ships came. The child who had been torn from her family all those years ago was fully gone now, replaced by someone who remembered being her but could no longer truly access what that person had felt or wanted or hoped for. I closed the hidden room and sealed it, knowing I would likely never open it again. The memories were too painful and too useless, relics of someone I no longer was and could never be again. Better to let them fade entirely than to keep revisiting wounds that would not heal. The deployment transport was utilitarian, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. I boarded with 24 other newly sanctioned psychers, all of us wearing the plain grey robes that marked our status, valuable assets but also dangerous ones requiring constant monitoring. We did not speak to each other during the journey. What would have been the point? We had all survived the same breaking and remaking. We all carried the same scars. Comparing them would accomplish nothing. The Arbites fortress where I was assigned was exactly what I expected: all hard angles and harder people, an institution dedicated to enforcement through overwhelming force and the systematic removal of anything that threatened order. My quarters were a small cell, my duties clearly defined, my value to the organization measured purely in terms of utility. I performed interrogations, reading emotional states of suspects and occasionally nudging those states toward confession or cooperation. I filed reports in the approved format. I maintained my mental disciplines and my psychic control. I served. Years passed in this way, blurring together into an extended present without clear demarcation. I aged, my body accumulating the wear of decades, my face in mirrors becoming increasingly unfamiliar. Sometimes I would encounter other psychers and recognize the same hollowness in their eyes, the look of people who had survived their gifts but lost themselves in the process. Sometimes, late in the duty cycles when exhaustion lowered my mental barriers, I would catch myself wondering about my family, whether they still lived, whether they ever thought of me, whether Davos had told the stories about our time together, or whether those two had faded into uncomfortable history better left unexamined. But I learned to stop those thoughts before they developed momentum, to redirect attention to immediate duties, to remember that I was a tool serving a purpose, and tools did not indulge in pointless nostalgia. The Imperium had taken me, broken me down, and rebuilt me into something useful. That was the reality I inhabited. That was the truth I served. And if that service required the sacrifice of everything I had been, everyone I had loved, every possibility I might have pursued, well, countless billions made similar sacrifices for the Imperium's continuation. My individual tragedy was not special or particularly noteworthy. It was simply the price extracted for the crime of being born different in a civilization that could not tolerate uncontrolled difference. I told myself this often enough that I almost believed it, almost accepted it without the bitter undercurrent of loss that never quite disappeared no matter how many years passed, almost convinced myself that what I had become was adequate compensation for what I had lost. But in the deepest part of night, when duty allowed brief respite and mental disciplines relaxed their grip, I would sometimes remember a small child who had never wanted to hurt anyone, who had tried so hard to be good, who had believed that love alone might be enough to solve anything. That child was gone, had been gone for decades, would never return. But I remembered her anyway, kept her ghost alive in ways I knew were probably unhealthy, but could not quite relinquish. Because if I forgot her completely, if I let the Imperium's systematic erasure finish its work, then they would have won utterly, and I needed to believe that somewhere, in the hidden architecture of my carefully controlled psyche, there remained at least one locked door they had not managed to fully open, one small space of resistance against the totality of their claims on who and what I was. It was not much. It was perhaps not even real resistance, but it was all I had, and I would not let it go. I will not forget them, even if the Imperium teaches me to.